First of all, welcome to Northview. For golfers that are here today, we unfortunately didn't have tee times for you. This is serious business. The second installment of our legislative series. By popular demand, Patrick Gilligan Hackett is back with us tonight. I'm glad you're here, Patrick, and I'm pleased that you found the place without any difficulty. We also have a facilitator with us tonight as well, Jennifer Gervs-Keen, and Jennifer is sitting at the very back. I suggested to her that this was more of a refereeing job than a facilitating job. I hope people take that in the humor it's intended. So I'm going to step aside here and let Patrick take the mic. I didn't scramble your notes, Patrick, so I'll leave it to you. Okay.
Good afternoon. For those of you who were at the presentation I did for the Senate, I'll apologize in advance for a little bit of overlap today with some of the material that we covered then, but you'll appreciate that the themes we're dealing with today are broadly related to the themes we dealt with at the Senate workshop. For those of you who were at the Senate workshop, I'm going to begin with a little biographical information which you've heard before, just to give a bit of orientation to the people who are new to this session. John and I got to know each other a little bit in connection with some work I've been doing for Kwantlen on a particular project, but I do a lot of work for universities in British Columbia, including Kwantlen. I act for 6 universities. So it's a big part of my practice and has been a big part of my practice for many years. In addition, I'm a past president of the Canadian Association of University Solicitors, which is the national organization of both in-house and external counsel who act across Canada for universities. So I bring to the topic today some perspectives that I've developed over the time that I've acted for universities, some experiences I've had, some of the problems I've dealt with, and some conclusions I've reached about how to optimize the function of universities in relation to their societal task, but also in relation to their more specific focus on research and teaching activity. Obviously, Kwantlen is facing a very interesting and somewhat unique challenge. It's not alone in the province in facing the challenge, but everybody and every institution goes through their own unique and individual experience of meeting a challenge. And that challenge is to move from being a university college to being a university. And a key element in that transition is the arrival of a bicameral governance structure. That's a structure that is contemplated by the University Act, which exists at the older universities in the province and indeed across the country and elsewhere, and which is a hallmark of a university as opposed to the other types of post-secondary institutions that exist. It's not unexpected that moving to that model where you have a Senate with a distinct authority and responsibility and associated powers, and a board with a distinct responsibility and authority and associated powers has its moments. John indicated to me that one of his initiatives while he's the president of the institution is to try and foster a fuller understanding on the part of all who are involved in the governance of the institution of the way in which that model works, of the responsibilities and powers that are associated with it, and in addition, not as a footnote but as a pendant to the operation of that model, the role of the president in a university. I've given you some written materials to save you the trouble of taking notes, to give you a reference going forward for some of the information that I provide today. I don't propose to follow those notes slavishly, although I'll refer to them during the discussion. The structure of the discussion, as I understand it, is for me to speak Normally, I like to encourage some questions and dialogue as I speak. I find that's a more lively and engaged presentation for the audience. But John mentioned today that with the facilitator, he'd like the first portion to be very much informational and then for dialogue, discussion, questions, debate to follow afterwards. So I've provided in the notes a little bit of an introduction, and I've covered some of the same material in my remarks. I then discussed the historical nature of the university. I don't propose to spend a lot of time on that today, but it is worth referring to that material because it's an important context for the structure that exists in the University Act and in the universities in British Columbia. And while it seems odd to refer to the Middle Ages when we're at Northview Golf and Country Club in the 21st century, the reality is that the roots of the corporate governance structure that exists at a university are found in the prototypical corporations that began to emerge in the Middle Ages, things like the colleges at Oxford, the Inns of Court in London, which regulate the barristers, and some of the medieval guilds and so on. And some of the offices that exist in a university are reflective of that origin. So a university has a chancellor and a vice-chancellor, although we use the term vice president finance. The Act refers to a bursar. Well, those are offices that one could quite possibly find in a prototypical corporation in the Middle Ages. And one of the consequences of that is that, as with many of those institutions, there's a tremendous focus on the autonomy of the institution and of the right of the institution and its members to engage in self-governance. And that's a privilege which society accords through the legislature to self-regulated professions like mine, but also to key institutions like the College of Physicians and Surgeons or the universities. And features of that self-governance, which are linked to the university's legal identity, include an emphasis on process, particularly in relation to the admission of applicants to membership in the university, the appointment and promotion of the university's faculty members, the removal of faculty members, the establishment of the faculties themselves, which, as you know, are often divided into departments and schools, reflecting specialized academic interests, which are overseen by deans, the establishment and recognition of the senior university offices to which I've referred, the establishment of internal tribunals to regulate the institution's affairs. Lawyers know those as domestic tribunals, the recognition of convocation in the statute, and the legally recognized right of university to grant degrees of membership to those who have completed a prescribed course of study. And those are all the things that I typically call the wallpaper. They're so prevalent, they're around us all the time that people lose sight of them, and yet they really are the constituent elements of the experience of being a university and governing a university. Now, as probably all of you recognize, in British Columbia, it's the University Act which constitutes a university, and the various components which I've referred to in the historical discussion are reflected in the Act. And under the heading, the University Act, I just break it down into the parts and what each of them deals with. John asked me to focus today on some specific elements in the Act, and those are primarily the relationship, as I indicated earlier, between the board and the Senate in a bicameral governance structure, and the role of the president in relation to those matters. One of the things John asked me to focus on is the legal notions or principles that surround the requirement for advice, consultation, and approval. And so after discussing a little bit the case law that surrounds the bicameral governance model, we'll touch on that as well, and then we'll look at some specific authorities that the Senate, the board, and the president have under the statute. You'll probably be relieved to know that there's not a lot of case law on the bicameral governance model. There is some, It typically hasn't arisen in the context of a battle between the Senate and the board, but rather in contexts that are incidental to the exercise of either the Senate's or the board's powers, where the courts have had occasion to comment on those powers and how they should be exercised. And perhaps helpfully, two of the key cases are relatively recent decisions of our Court of Appeal. They're discussed in the materials. One is the Faculty Association of the University of British Columbia and University of British Columbia, which I just call UBC 2010. That case involved a labor relations dispute. Essentially, the Senate, in the exercise of its power to govern a university's academic affairs, had issued a policy regarding student evaluation of faculty. That policy was not on all fours with the board's negotiated collective agreement with the faculty. There's no question in the case that the Senate had validly exercised its power, and there was no question in the case that the board had validly exercised its power. So it wasn't a fight between the board and the Senate about whether a given power had been exercised in a valid way. The problem came when the Faculty Association challenged the Senate policy as being inconsistent with the collective agreement, and an arbitrator said, I don't think I've got jurisdiction over this because I don't think I've got any jurisdiction over a valid exercise of the Senate's power. So that was the issue that ended up being discussed in the courts and was a context for both the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal to discuss the bicameral governance model. And I've quoted a little bit from the Court of Appeal's reasons because I think they're quite helpful to understand some of the key principles. The majority of board members are appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. Section 19.2 of the Act provides that the board of UBC is composed of 21 members, the Chancellor, the President, 11 persons appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council, 3 faculty members elected by faculty, 3 students elected by students, and 2 employees elected by employees. Pursuant to Section 27 of the Act, the board is vested with, quote, the management, administration, and control of the property, revenue, business, and affairs of the university, close quote. It is the business arm of the university, and in that capacity has the power to appoint and remove senior officials and faculty on the recommendation of the President. The board's power to enter into the collective agreement on behalf of UBC is found in Section 27.2, which specifically gives the board the power to, quote, enter into agreements on behalf of the university. And the court goes on to note the Senate is broadly responsible for a university's academic affairs. Unlike the board, the Senate's membership is composed primarily of elected faculty and students. The composition of the Senate is set forth in Section 35.1 of the Act. The current Senate is composed of 90 members, made up of the Chancellor, the President, who is chair, the academic vice president or equivalent, the deans of faculties, the chief librarian, the director of continuing education, 36 elected faculty, 18 elected students, 4 persons who are not faculty members elected by convocation, 1 member elected by the governing body of each affiliated college of the university, and additional members determined by the Senate. In terms of accountability, it is significant that elected faculty form a substantial component of Senate membership. Section 37 of the Act provides that the Senate is vested with the academic governance of the university and sets out the statutory responsibilities of the Senate in that regard. Although student evaluation of teachers is not expressly provided for in the powers granted to the Senate under the Act, it is accepted by the parties and the interveners that student evaluations properly fall under the Senate's power over academic governance. The Court of Appeal recognized that in addition to areas of autonomous responsibility and power, the board and the Senate also share areas of responsibility and power. In addition to the powers expressly granted to each of the board and the Senate, the Act also provides for intersecting or overlapping powers between those two bodies. For example, in some instances, the Senate is empowered only to make recommendations to the board, and in one instance, it requires board approval of its actions. None of these intersecting or overlapping powers has been relied on by the parties. Finally, the court recognized that the university has, as a whole, has powers and duties and that the section conferring those powers and duties provides general guidance about the manner in which they are to be exercised. Part 10 of the Act deals with powers and duties of a university and states in Section 46(1) that a university has the power and capacity of a natural person of full capacity. One of the university's stated functions, and I just note that Kwantlen has not got an equivalent subsection, is to generally promote and carry on the work of a university in all of its branches through the cooperative effort of the board, senate, and other constituent parts of the university. Thus, the Act contemplates cooperation between the board and the Senate in carrying out the work of the university, but it does not provide for a tiebreaker or the equivalent of a paramountcy provision if the exercise of powers by the board and Senate respectively come into conflict, as here. And then they note a specific provision where there is an authority in the board to resolve a dispute. At the same time, while there is no tiebreaker provision in a conflict between the board and the Senate, there is a clear expectation among the judiciary that a board and Senate will cooperate in the governance of a university. And I think this is said without reference to the specific statutory provision that I've noted, and it picks up a theme in a case out of Ontario, which we'll touch on in a moment. I agree with the arbitrator that while the structure of the Act and the allocation of powers between the board and the Senate admit of the potential for operational conflict from time to time, the Act expressly sets out the areas in which the board and Senate have separate powers and those where the powers are intersecting or overlapping. As Mr. Justice Sharp stated in Kulczycki, that's the Ontario case I mentioned, one would expect the board and Senate to cooperate in all areas of mutual interest. I'm going to digress for a moment to say that's really perhaps the key theme today, the expectation in the courts that there will be cooperation, even where there may be differences of opinion. It's, as I put it, I think when I was talking to the Senate, and certainly how I think of it, it's not a political model, it's a governance model. And I think there's a subtle but significant difference there. A political model contemplates that interests will be advanced through a form of advocacy. If we think of Parliament or the legislature, people elect their representatives from political parties with platforms. The platforms reflect interests, and the purpose of an election is to determine which party's mandate will prevail, which party will hold a majority. That's a political system. A governance model is something different. It's designed to ensure that an institution like Kwantlen runs to the best of its potential while providing a mechanism for reconciling through consultation and cooperation the natural points of difference that may arise. And those don't necessarily have to be controversial points of difference. The board, as you've seen, has a responsibility for the business affairs and operations of an institution and has a natural and appropriate concern with managing a university's revenue. It's not a bottomless pocket. The Senate, as you've seen, has a natural and appropriate concern with a university's academic governance and may be sincerely convinced that a given program should be expanded or added to the university's offerings, and there's a potential there for a difference of opinion based on different concerns, different focal points, different responsibilities. In a governance model, those differences are, in my view, dealt with, as I say, through a process of cooperation and consultation, rather than through a process of advocacy for a position based on interests as the dominant consideration. And I've mentioned Kulczycki, and I touch on that because it's a significant case when trying to form an understanding of what happens when things go wrong. It's a decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal. As I mentioned, it influenced the BC Court of Appeal's analysis in UBC 2010. And in Kulczycki, two faculty members, one of whom was also a senator, mounted a legal challenge to a decision by the board to consolidate Trent's operations and facilities on a single campus, with the result that certain other operations would be closed and their associated facilities sold off. The board's decision was made in response to both serious problems with Trent's finances and decaying infrastructure, and was reached on the basis of a report from a representative task force. Trent's Senate opposed the decision. The legal challenge to the board's decision invoked, among other matters, an allegation that Trent's Senate had to approve the consolidation reflected in the board's decision. As in UBC 2010, the result turned on the authority and powers allocated to the board and the Senate by Trent's constitutional statute. In Kulczewski, the Ontario Court of Appeal found that the statute conferred on the board the necessary power and authority to decide to consolidate Trent's operations and to sell the facilities made redundant by the consolidation. The OCA noted that many political arguments had been made against the board's decision, but indicated that at the end of the day, those arguments were, in a legal sense, irrelevant. The central issue for the Ontario Court of Appeal was a legal one. Did the board have the authority to make the decision an issue? And if so, was that authority in any sense conditional on the Senate's involvement or approval? And I'll turn to Kulczewski in a bit more detail later, but I want to note one final BC decision. I call it UBC 27 because it's the same parties as in the case I've already referred to. And in that decision, there was again an issue around an arbitral award. It concerned an arbitrator's decision that she could reverse the president's decision not to recommend a faculty member for promotion. And most of you will probably be aware that the University Act authorizes the board to appoint, promote, and remove faculty, but only on the recommendation of the president. It's a precondition to the board's exercise of its power that the president makes a recommendation. So the arbitrator purported to reverse the president's recommendation. The issue was whether that was within the arbitrator's jurisdiction or the decision should have been referred back to the president with some direction as to where things had gone wrong. The court commented on the authority of the president under the Act and said this: the association argues that the parties to the collective agreement were entitled to agree that the remedial provisions in the agreement would operate in the manner interpreted by the arbitrator, so as to grant an arbitrator the authority either to direct the president to exercise the statutory grant of power set out in the University Act in a particular way, or to bypass the grant of authority to the president by having the recommendation to the Board of Governors proceed as a deemed recommendation of the president. The process that the original panel, that's a reference to the Labor Relations Board, described as not requiring the president to do anything. I would not give effect to that submission. The parties to the collective agreement could not agree to restrict or fetter in scope the president's exercise of statutory authority by making any such exercise of that statutory power to recommend subject to reversal by an arbitrator. Any interpretation of the arbitrator's remedial authority pursuant to the collective agreement that allowed the arbitrator to reverse the president's decision on matters governed by the president's statutory grant of authority would constitute a direct interference with that statutory grant of power and would be incompatible and inconsistent with the statutory scheme. So as you'll see from these cases, what the courts recognize is that the Act establishes a governance model, the key components of which are the board and Senate, each with their area of responsibility, the associated authority and powers that are necessary to discharge that responsibility, that there's an overlap where there's an expectation of collaboration, cooperation, good faith dealings between the board and the Senate where there are differences of view, and a recognition inherent in that those differences of view may be fruitful. The board may not have thought of something that the Senate identifies as an important consideration. The Senate, in its discussions with the board, may have a new understanding of some of the limitations that the board faces. So nothing I'm saying should be taken as implying that the consultation or collaboration is necessarily a negative context or reflective of negative considerations. It may well be, as I say, fruitful of a fuller understanding of an issue and a better solution. As I said, it's a governance model, not a political model. So within that scheme, there's also a recognition that the President has specific statutory powers, and that those powers are entitled to the same respect and recognition as the Senate's powers and the Board's powers. It's not open to the Senate or the Board to wheel and deal in the President's powers. And so that's, as I say, not so much a footnote to the bicameral governance model as a pendant or an important adjunct to it. Now, I mentioned I would touch a bit more on Kulczycki, and I think it's useful to do so when discussing the relationship between the Senate and the Board of Governors. And so at paragraph 32, I note that the judicial expectation that the Board and Senate of a university will cooperate even in the absence of an express statutory requirement to do so is well recognized. And I suggest that that kind of cooperation is a mark of institutional maturity. Kulczycki provides an instructive example of what happens when such cooperation has not been established or has broken down. The Ontario Court of Appeal noted the long-standing dysfunctional relationship that existed between the Senate and the Board at Trent, and the negative impact which that dysfunctional relationship had had on the interests of Trent and its constituent elements. Quoting from the decision, "It appears from the material filed by the respondent university that the relationship between the academic side of the university, the Senate, and those responsible for the financing and maintenance of the facilities, the Board, has historically been far from harmonious. Over time, the university's bicameral governance system, which appears to have worked satisfactorily in other universities, created fractiousness in the Trent University community and led to numerous internal conflicts. The deterioration of the governance system was one of the matters addressed by an external review of the university's administration conducted in 1997 by H.W. Arthurs and Joyce Lorimer. Their report, External Review of the Administration of Trent University, stated in part at page 4, the fractiousness which has characterized the Trent community for over 2 decades, we suggest, reflects very real and unresolved internal conflicts. These conflicts are manifest in debates over governance structures, Trent's formal allocation of decision-making responsibility between the Board, senior administration, Senate, faculty council, departments and colleges, and management resemble provisions elsewhere. However, in practice, Trent appears to have translated the informal habits of earlier and smaller days into a politically fragmented system, which, while properly anticipating widespread consultation of all constituencies, has no clear means of moving on from disagreement amongst them. This system, described to us as a system of multiple vetoes, is particularly problematic because of the difficulty of balancing the priorities of different constituency interests in a climate of economic stringency. I say it's fair to say that in the above paragraphs, the Ontario Court of Appeal is not describing a recipe for long-term institutional success. Ultimately, I think the relationship between the Senate and the Board requires a genuine recognition and understanding that the governance model of a university is bicameral, and that within that model, the Senate and the Board are largely autonomous with their designated areas of authority and the exercise of their associated powers. At the same time, the manner in which that authority and those powers are exercised can foster or impede good governance. Which course is followed has important implications when the Board and the Senate are required by the Act to interact in the exercise of their respective authorities and powers. Now, I lay out a little bit of the background to the Board's responsibility and powers. I don't propose to deal in detail with that here. And I do the same thing with respect to the Senate's responsibility and powers. You'll have a sense of those respective areas from my comments and from my references to the court decisions, and they're there for ready reference. What I do want to turn to today, further to John's request, is some discussion of what the law means when it talks about consultation. And I say that because, as I indicate in my discussion of the Senate's powers, there are a reasonable number of reasonably significant areas where the Senate has the right to advise or recommend, or in some cases approve, the board's proposed course of action. And those are the sort of interactional areas where collaboration and cooperation are required in order for the institution to be, in a governmental sense, functional. There isn't a case that I'm aware of that deals in a meaningful way, or at all for that matter, with that language in the University Act. That's probably a reassuring thing. It works well most of the time in most places. But understanding what might have to occur to make it well is a different problem. And I think there, as I say, some of the judicial discussion of consultation and what consultation may entail is helpful, because advice and recommendations, and to some degree a requirement for approval, are all forms of consultation. Many of you will know from reading the newspapers or from some type of direct experience that the courts have developed over the last 15 or so years a requirement that the Crown consult with First Nations about potential development or use of lands over which First Nations assert a form of title. And the most detailed and sophisticated discussions of consultation that I'm aware of have occurred in those cases. And in particular, one called Haida Nation and British Columbia Ministry of Forests, which the Supreme Court of Canada decided in 2004, provides, albeit in a completely different context, I think quite a full and helpful discussion of what consultation requires. And so I'm at paragraph 56, and I know that, and this isn't, I should add, an exhaustive discussion of the court's points. I tried to pick the ones that I thought were most helpful and germane to the present context. But the court said that the content of the duty will vary with the circumstances, and I think that's applicable in a university. Some decisions will be relatively minor in their consequences, or one-time only decisions. They may require consultation because of the provisions of the statute, but they don't necessarily, because they're not of major significance, require the most intensive level or deep level of consultation. The scope of the duty is proportionate to the interests at stake. So that's a related point, that there's got to be some proportionality between what processes are invoked to facilitate consultation and the interests which are at stake. A decision to shut down a faculty might require rather more in the way of process than a decision to expand a small program. The duty must be discharged in good faith and must be meaningful and appropriate, again taking the surrounding circumstances into account. Lawyers talk a lot about good faith. It's an important concept, and it means that people approach the decision-making process, the consultation process, with a sincere desire to contribute productively and meaningfully to the process, to engage in a dialogue rather than a shouting match, to ensure that exchanges are purposive as opposed to obstructive, and other related activities. In discharging the duty, the procedural safeguards associated with natural justice may be considered. That's a little bit contextual in the Haida Nation case. Obviously, given the nature of the consultation the court was requiring the Crown to engage in. But I think it's helpful in a university context as well. And I note with interest that in Kulczycki, the board had commissioned a representative panel to conduct an inquiry into the options that were available before the board made the decision to shut down a portion of Trent's operations. And though I didn't give you the passage from the decision, when you read the decision, the panel was representative. It had all sorts of people on it, both from the institution and the community. And it had a form of hearing, not in a legal sense, but it allowed submissions to be made. That's an example of taking the sorts of processes that exist in an administrative law context and adapting them, obviously in Kulczycki, to a major decision. And I think, as I say, although that comment was made by the Supreme Court in the context of a pretty engaged and intensive consultation process, it does have application here. Sharp dealing is not permitted, and so it comes back to the obligation to participate in good faith. There can't be hidden agendas, there can't be irrelevant agendas, there can't be personal agendas, there can't be a derailing of the consultation process to advance those sorts of inappropriate or improper agendas. Satisfying the duty to consult does not require agreement. Obviously, where there's a requirement for the Senate's approval, there has to be a form of agreement, but where the Senate's authority and entitlement is to advise or recommend to the board a course of action, consultation can occur without there being a requirement for agreement. So at the end of the day, everybody participating in good faith, the board may choose a course of action with which the Senate ultimately doesn't agree. That doesn't mean the duty to consult didn't get satisfied. One side must not take unreasonable positions or act simply to frustrate the other side's efforts to consult, and that's obviously critical. And finally, deep consultation may require the provision of opportunities for written submissions and other direct engagement in the decision-making process. And I would refer back to my comments about Kulczycki as an example of what I would call deep consultation, a body specifically assigned, representative in nature, a significant process of taking soundings to determine what course of action is appropriate. Not every decision clearly is going to require deep consultation or nothing will ever happen. And similar principles are reflected in two other areas of law where consultation has been discussed, and those are in administrative and labor relations law decisions. As I say, the principles there are similar. I want to touch finally on the President's responsibility and powers. As I noted in discussing UBC 27, those are statutory grants of power. The President enjoys those with full autonomy and has the right to exercise them in the context of that autonomy. The President's responsibility and powers are found particularly in sections 59 through 63 of the Act. A university must have a president. He or she is the university's chief executive officer. He or she has the responsibility to generally supervise and direct the university's academic work. Among other offices, the president is ex officio a member of the board and must attend its meetings, and is the chair of the Senate. And I'll come back to that particular pairing of offices in a moment, because I think in the context of my discussion of governance, it's significant and important. The President has the power to recommend the appointment, promotion, and removal of faculty and the university's officers and employees. In the case of faculty, while the board has the power to appoint, promote, and remove faculty, it cannot do so except on the President's recommendation. The President has the power to summon meetings of one or more faculties and to establish such committees as he/she considers necessary or advisable. The President has the right to suspend any university employee and any university student. In consultation with the appropriate standing committee of Senate, of which, by the way, the President will be a member as of right, the President prepares the university's annual budget and submits it to the board, prepares the university's annual report, makes necessary recommendations to the board and the Senate, and must report on any matter referred to the President by the board or the Senate. Finally, although the power to do so does not limit the President's powers, any faculty may advise the President on any academic or disciplinary matter affecting the interests of the university. So the President has a significant responsibility and role in ensuring the effectiveness of a university's governance. As I said, I wanted to touch in that context on the fact that the President is ex officio a member of the board with an obligation to attend the board's meetings and the chair of the Senate. I think the Act contemplates that the President, as the Chief Executive Officer, will be a critical link between the Senate and the board. The one individual in the entire governance structure who is certain to be fully informed about the board's deliberations, concerns, issues, and also fully informed about the Senate's deliberations, concerns, and issues. And that role is embodied in the statute and obviously, as you've seen, exists independently of anything the Senate or the board might think or care to do. But again, putting it in a more positive context, I think it lends itself to facilitating effective and optimal governance of the institution. And associated with that role are the President's executive powers and advisory role in relation to both academic matters and financial matters. So the President functions as the person who is responsible generally for supervising and directing the university's academic work, but also in connection with the preparation and delivery of the university's budget to the board, acting with input of the appropriate Senate committee. I'll just touch on the same conclusion that I touched on when I spoke with the Senate. The perils of dysfunction in a bicameral governance structure are vividly illustrated by the facts in Kulczycki. In the words of the Ontario Court of Appeal, Trent desperately needed to restructure its administration in order to cut costs and put it in a position to take advantage of a government initiative whereby scarce capital funds would be made available for capital improvements and renewal of the infrastructure. Yet despite Trent's desperate needs, there was sustained opposition, including opposition from the Senate, to the measures the Board of Trent, acting within its authority, had resolved to take. This crisis played out against a lengthy history of dysfunction in the relationship between the Senate and the board. Given the Ontario Court of Appeal's findings about the factual background to the case and the circumstances to which the board was responding, there is every appearance of a complete collapse in the viability of the bicameral governance model at Trent. No one would argue that such an outcome could be characterized in any way as being in Trent's best interest. At the end of the day, the quality and success of the bicameral governance model and its associated processes rests in the hands of its participants. Inevitably, disputes and disagreements will arise, and not all of them will be resolved to every participant's satisfaction. At the same time, every participant in the bicameral governance process must be presumed to share a common desire to see Kwantlen flourish. The most critical contribution that any participant can make to the quality and success of the bicameral governance process is to keep this common desire firmly in mind and to act accordingly. So those are my remarks this afternoon in, as I said at the beginning, an effort to give you a somewhat informed overview of the bicameral governance model and the important associated role of the President as it's constituted by the University Act and as it's been discussed in some relevant case law. I understand from John the idea now is that there'll be an opportunity for discussion and questions facilitated as John indicated, and so with that I've done my duty this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Would people like to get up and have another cup of coffee, refresh their drinks, and then we can move into Q&A? And Jennifer is going to help us with that. May give people a few moments to formulate some questions that I'm sure we all have about the process that Patrick has been addressing. Jennifer.
Get up and move around for a few minutes? Yes?
Sure.
Yes? Okay.
Everybody can be seated. Perfect. So thank you all for being here today, and my thanks to John and Sandy for getting this set up and inviting me to participate in your discussion. We're looking at, obviously, a lot of what Patrick said earlier, and we will be going into a Q&A session to start off with if people have any lingering questions after his presentation. But what we're also hoping to accomplish today is to get the conversation started in terms of, well, I guess there's probably more than one objective here. Primarily deeper the understanding, gain a better understanding of not only the roles of the board and Senate and president independently, but also jointly, and what did that looks like. And that was obviously a big piece of what Patrick was doing today and had done before with the Senate. But also looking at, on an individual level and as a group, what does that look like day to day? And what are the obstacles, if any? What are the challenges? How are people feeling about that? Let's make it as effective as possible, essentially. And also looking at, the collaboration and cooperation piece. And specifically why this evening I think is also a little bit social in terms of having the dinner afterwards. And I will be watching my time, so I'm not going to make you starve. But in terms of relationship building, it's really critical for the university that these two groups with the president can work together and will work together. But I also feel that it's critical that you enjoy it while you do it. So hopefully the relationship building is going to be a part of that. And I would really encourage you, if you are staying for dinner, to sit with people you don't necessarily know and start some of those conversations and get that going. So we are going to have a Q&A. We're going to open the discussion afterwards. What I would ask is that if you are participating in the discussion, when you say something for the first time, if you could say your name so I can address you politely if I have to interrupt you. And then also, obviously, a respectful, constructive discussion is what we are hoping for this evening. There is a flip chart. If there are any aha moments, light bulbs, things that people want to take particular note of, that's why it's there, and I can do that for you if you wish. And then obviously be succinct and to the point, because we don't have hours, we have an hour, more or less. And I would like to start off by, as John said, my name is Jennifer Jarvis-Keane. I'm a professional facilitator and coach. I do a huge variety of work. And but essentially the point of all of it is helping organizations and individuals become more effective. That's pretty much the bottom line. And to get started, I have heard from several people that they don't necessarily know people in the room. So being as we have a couple of minutes, I would ask that we go around and everyone say their name and short, because we have a lot of people in the room, and essentially your role at Kwantland in terms of why you're here today. All right, so if we want to start with the front table. And speak loudly, please, so we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Roby Kozak. I'm elected faculty representative from the Faculty of Humanities for the next...
Counting down, okay.
And I also have other duties. I'm chair of the English Department and of Humanities Faculty Council.
Great, thank you.
Anna Levac, Provost and Vice President Academic.
I'm Chris Giordap, Senator.
Carrie Michaels, I also sit on the Senate.
John Stew,
John McHenry, President Pro Tem.
I'm Ken Hughes. I'm an elected faculty member, senator, and I'm coordinator of the graphic design and marketing program and the product design program.
I'm Cassandra Linkleader, and I'm the student representative on the board.
Ariana Arpolo, and I am the professional support staff rep on the board, and I work in institutional analysis and planning.
Thank you. Back table.
I'm Larissa Petrillo, elected a member on Faculty of Social Sciences and Student of the Arts on Senate.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Arthur Cord. You know what's coming. Dean of Western Canada's largest and most dynamic school of business. Scott Nichol, Board of Governors.
Suzanne Pierce, faculty rep on the Board of Governors.
And I'm Jan Horwood. I'm elected to Senate by librarians. I'm a non-voting member. There was a little change made at the time that after my last term as the senator was up, the former president kind of finagled a non-voting seat for librarians, something that we appreciated, but I don't think the details have quite been worked out yet. But in case you're wondering why I never vote, that's why.
You'd like to.
I would like to, yeah.
All right, middle table in the back.
Betty Cannon, faculty, School of Horticulture Sciences. I'm Wendy Royal, and I represent the Faculty of Academic and Career Advancement, and I'm saying that with hesitation because we've changed our name a lot of times, and I'm never quite sure which is the latest name, and I think it's still that.
Gordon Schoberg, Chair of the Board of Governors.
Bob Davis, Faculty Senator, Trades and Technology.
Shane King, Board of Governors. I'm one of the alumni reps, and I'm also the chair of the Audit Advance Committee on the Board of Governors.
All right. Final back table.
Elizabeth Merritt, and I work in the University Secretariat.
Carrie Thompson, University Secretariat.
I'm Robert Hensley, and I'm the University Registrar, and I'm an ex officio member of the Senate.
Boston University Secretary.
Thank you. Table up front.
Graham Rankin, Dean of Science and Horticulture.
Kim Richter, faculty member for BC's or Western Canada's largest school of business. I'm also one of the faculty reps to the Board of Governors. Thank you.
Ken Town, Board of Governors.
Wayne Tebb, Dean of Trades and Technology.
I'm Harpreet Baines, and I'm actually a director with the Alumni Association as well as an alumni appointee, a voting member on Senate.
Table in front here.
Good afternoon. I'm Amrit Burke. I'm Vice Chair of the Board, and I chair the HR Committee as well.
George Berge, Dean of the Faculty of Design.
True Freeman, Dean of Community and Health Studies.
Robert Wood, School of Business Faculty Senator.
Martin McDonald, University Librarian. Oh,
Last but not least.
Hallie Wade, Senator, Faculty of Trades and Technology, and the Coordinator of Public Safety Communications.
Christine Crowe, Dean of the Faculty of Academic and Career Advancement and Chair of the Tributes Committee. Kristen Ash, Board of Governors, Alumni Rep, Chair of the Alumni Association, and I am the Board Representative at Senate, non-voting.
Maggie Hall, I'm the professional support staff rep on Senate, and my day job is Chief Information Officer.
Jennifer O. I'm the elected faculty senator for the Faculty of Science and Horticulture.
All right, great. I don't think we missed anyone. All right, so questions. Start off with a few questions. Does anyone have any questions for Patrick? Yes.
In paragraph number 67, where the situation of the bicameral government structure presented in the Kuczynski case, my question is there a significant difference between the legislation that governs Trent and the legislation that governs Kwantlen? And would that affect, would we be able to look at this as relevant case law in BC?
Right. Okay. Patrick?
Sure, thanks. Situation in Ontario is a little bit different than British Columbia because I don't know if it's the case with every Ontario university, but many of them have individual statutes constituting them, and so there may be some slight variances. But I do think it's relevant. Keep in mind that our Court of Appeal in UBC 2010 referred to the decision in Kulczycki at some length, and clearly the analysis in the Court of Appeals decision in UBC 2010 picked up themes that were developed in Kulczycki. I noted the comment of our court quoting Mr. Justice Sharp in Kulczycki about the cooperation that's expected to occur. So I think the answer is the statutory context may be a little bit different, but the principles are applicable and were treated as applicable by the highest court in this province.
More of a comment than a question. I wanted to just let you know, I think most of us in the room know that there's a joint task force between Board and Senate that's been going for a year, about a year now. We've met several times. The intention of that task force is, first of all, in recognition of the new roles of both the Board and the Senate pursuant to the new legislation that we operate under. The potential for for conflict, and the desire for a harmonious relationship. And through this last year, we've worked hard with a facilitator to develop policy around some key areas that we interface with, and we're working through a number of others, and that we've basically prioritized the list. So that work is going on, and I think it's very successful. I think it's really helped to create a good mutual understanding of some perspectives, at least around the table there. I'm not sure how much they effectively get conveyed to our respective groups, but I think that the work of that task force is admirable, and it needs to be commended, because it's setting a foundation for how we're going to relate and how we're going to govern the university in the future years. So out of this work is going to come a series of, I think, good relationships, but also a policy platform that is going to help smooth decision making. So I thought I'd just mention that for everybody's benefit.
Hi, Scott Nickel. First, Patrick, I'd like to say thank you very much for doing this. You answered a number of questions that I had, but I've got a few more. First off, this is a question that I've struggled with since we moved to this, and many people in this room have heard me pose this question before, and I think at least my own satisfaction, answered the question. The difference between the first section of the powers of the non-special purpose teaching university senates versus the description of powers for the special purpose teaching university senates. And when you compare and contrast the powers of the boards, which are the same to all universities. And so my question is simply this: 27.1 sets up the powers of the boards. And my question is, does that section, in our case, mean the powers that aren't specifically granted to the Senate in our case, by default reside on the board?
I'd be a little cautious, Scott, about adopting that approach to analyzing the sections. And I say that having in mind the comment in UBC 2010 about the fact there's no paramountcy provision in the statute. So I don't think it's a case where one could assume automatically that the fact the University Act doesn't speak to a specific power being granted to a specific body necessarily means that the power resides in the other body. I recognize, and you've picked up on it in your question, that Section 27(1) speaks fairly broadly to the board's powers. But it's equally clear that, and the case law makes this clear, that those powers are primarily in relation to the university's business as opposed to its academic governance. And so I think, as I say, to assume that that's a paramountcy provision is inconsistent with the case law. The other comment I'd make in that regard is again, picking up on UBC 2010, the ease with which the court was prepared to read the Senate's exercise of power to create a policy in relation to student evaluations as within the Senate's jurisdiction, notwithstanding that there was no express reference to a power on the part of the Senate to create such a policy. So I think a better way to look at it is really in terms of areas of responsibility, and to assume that neither the Senate nor the board is paramount, and that each is expected to fully respect the other's area of responsibility. I think, just to close my comments on that the broad provision in Section 27.1 clearly contemplates that the board, in relation to any matter that can legitimately be characterized as the university's business, has the requisite authority to deal effectively with the business. And then, as we saw, there are, and as I'm sure you know, you've asked an informed question, there are specific requirements for consultation in relation to the board's exercise of certain powers that it clearly has.
And I would agree with that in principle, but here's what gives me pause for this. This is where the question comes from. Section 37.1, which is the Senate provisions that were issued in the UC case, starts, the academic governance of the university is vested in the Senate, and it has the following powers. So the phrase uses the phrase, the academic governance of the university is vested in the Senate. The same section for the special purpose teaching university says, the Senate of a special purpose teaching university must make bylaws for the conduct of business, including bylaws specifying the duties of the Senate in a conflict of interest. The Senate of a special purpose teaching university has the power and duty to do all of the following. So the legislature, presumably intentionally, although I understand with respect to the statute that is in question, intentionally left out the phrase, the academic governance is vested. And it seems to me that, and I've raised this question because in my mind, to fail to read in some significance in that, in between the two sections, is, I think, significant.
Yeah, I would be, I guess, cautious about that because of two considerations. One, I think the creation of a Senate in and of itself indicates that the bicameral governance model exists. And two, I think it's fairly well known that the creation of the legislative provisions that dealt with a special purpose teaching university was, I don't want to be overly critical of the legislature, but a little bit of a rush job is what I've heard. And I think that there's a risk then in reading more into those sorts of considerations that might be warranted. The other thing that I think has to be kept in mind is there was also some impetus, as I understand it, to maintain some continuity between the university college structure and the special purpose teaching university structure. And so, for example, that phrase educational policy is used in relation to the board and the Senate, where the board is required to take advice from the Senate, and the Senate's required to provide advice with respect to the development of educational policies in certain areas. And I understand that is the phrase is a carryover from the university college days. So I'm not sure, I mean, I take the point, obviously, but I'm not sure that I would be inclined to put a lot of freight on that, given the overarching commitment to a bicameral governance model. I just don't see the Senate's authority as being unduly restricted. So that's my thinking on it. I mean, one day a judge may decide, but it's my thinking on it.
Yeah, carrying on with that theme, depending upon the intent of how the legislation got put together. It is what it is, and how it's written, and the comparisons to the College and Institutes Act, and you can look at that. My question for Patrick is around an expansion on the definition of academic governance as used with the research-intensive universities, and the specific nature of advice on education policy and the differences between those two. You alluded to it a little bit, and I wonder if you can expand on that, Patrick, a bit.
Sorry, I'm not really following the point of the question.
Well, the difference between education policy, which is in the special purpose teaching university section, and the academic governance that traditional universities have within their description of the duties of Senate, and around the academic governance. Now, to my opinion, the academic governance is a far overreaching description of the activities that Senate would be involved with, where there was a purposeful intent on the specificness of advising on education policy that is put to the special purpose teaching universities.
Patrick, sorry, if I could ask you to move to the podium because the people behind you are...
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Because this mic goes into the film, but it doesn't go out into the emergency room.
I can tell I better bring my act with me. So the question, in case you couldn't hear it, related to this issue of the Senate's responsibility for academic governance and the provision in the University Act around the consultation that's required between the Senate and the board in the development of educational policy. And the point of the question is that that set of provisions doesn't have an obvious counterpart in the provisions that create the Senates at the research universities. And picking up, I guess, a little bit on Scott's question about whether the general empowerment of the Senates at the research universities to deal with academic governance, which is echoed in the Senate provisions at special purpose teaching universities, is of notable significance. So, I mean, I think it's important, I'm a lawyer, right, so we like to look at the words. I think it is important to look at the words. You won't have a university act with you in every case, although I see some people have them. But section 35.26 says this: the Senate of a special purpose teaching university must advise the board, and the board must seek advice from the Senate on the development of educational policy for the following matters. And it then sets out 13 matters. I'll give you some samples: the mission statement and the educational goals, objectives, strategies, and priorities of the special purpose teaching university, the establishment, revision, or discontinuance of courses and programs at the special purpose teaching university, preparation and presentation of reports after implementation by the special purpose teaching university without prior review by the Senate of new non-credit programs or programs offered under service contract, priorities and implementation of new programs and courses leading to certificates, diplomas, or degrees, and a number of others that are in the same vein or that relate to the support systems that would be required or the human resources that would be required in relation to those matters. Bob, I see that as addressing the specific challenge that the legislation created for special purpose teaching universities. It's the challenge I alluded to at the start of my remarks, and it's really the challenge to move a university college environment and structure to a university environment and structure. And I think that's why the focus is very much on things like the establishment, revision, or discontinuance of courses and programs at the special purpose teaching university. Obviously, the anticipation was that in the, pick your number, the first 5 years, the first 10 years of the existence of a special purpose teaching university, there was every possibility that there would be a reasonable amount of necessary transition. Some programs would no longer make a lot of sense given the mandate of a special purpose teaching university. Other programs that hadn't been offered might come to make sense. And so I think a lot of this was designed to create a mechanism whereby those sorts of challenges, those sorts of transitional challenges in particular, could be addressed. It's not attached to a sunset clause, so it's not going to be spent. It may be there for a long time, given the difficulty of getting legislative amendments. But I think that was its primary purpose. I say that without having looked at any debate in Hansard, so there may have been comments about its specific purpose. But when I look at what it's talking about, it seems to me that a lot of those issues are first and foremost transitional issues, and they relate not only to the content of the educational programming, but also to the, as I said, the kind of infrastructure and human resources that are necessary to deal with those matters. Probably reflective as well a little bit, as I said earlier, of the historic structure at a university college. I said it provides a mechanism for dealing with those transitional issues because it clearly contemplates a collaborative effort on the part of Senate and the board to engage with and successfully address these issues. What strikes me as a lawyer is the requirement that the Senate must advise the board, so it's a mandatory requirement. If the Senate hypothetically refused to advise the board could go to court and get an order requiring the Senate to consult. And vice versa, the board must seek advice from the Senate. So if the board was willy-nilly operating in a high-handed manner, ignoring that obligation, it would be the Senate that could get an order at the end of the day requiring the board to consult. And that consultation takes place around, as you noted in your question, the development of educational policy in specific areas. Educational policy in those areas necessarily contemplates two things: the expenditure of resources, very much the board's concern, and the maintenance of the institution's academic integrity and focus, very much the Senate's concern. So that's why I say I see that section as the product of the specific circumstances in which the special purpose teaching universities found themselves. There didn't need to be an equivalent at the research universities because, with the exception of UNBC, which even now I guess is about 15 or 16 years old, early 90s, almost 20 years old now probably. UVic, I think, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year or last year. SFU is about the same stage, and UBC is, of course, older. So they've kind of worked through that phase of things, if you like. And so that's what I see as being the purpose of those provisions, and that's why I think they're in the legislation here, but not found in relation to the research universities.
Wendy? Yeah, sorry. Wendy, did you have a question?
I saw your hand up a while ago. I think I just wanted to continue with the term consultation.
Yes.
Because it seems that the relationship really hangs on effective consultation, but that word in itself is so broad. So is there a sort of checklist or procedure or policy so that both sides feel that due process has been done with the consultation?
Well, that was part of my purpose in discussing the Haida Nation case, because that, as I say, is one of the more detailed discussions in a relatively intensive context of principles of consultation. And it was to try and, I mean, it is addressing principles as opposed to a checklist, but it was to try and give some thematic signposts for the sort of mandate or process that you're talking about. It strikes me that the joint task force that the chair mentioned might be a helpful environment or a fruitful environment in which to start that sort of discussion. Obviously, there are other cases out there, and consultation isn't the sole prerogative of lawyers. It's just that happens to be where some of these principles have been discussed. So, my thought, picking up on the discussion that's been occurring, is that might be picked up as a useful topic for the joint task force, and with a view to developing maybe not a checklist, because keep in mind it's meant to be proportionate to the interests and so on that are at stake, but some guidelines, some signposts, as I call them, some general principles that will regulate the different types of consultation that are meant to take place. Again, that's an exercise in governance.
And if I can just add to that, not at all the legal definition of consultation, but when I've been involved in public consultation processes and those types of things, there isn't necessarily a step-to-step process, at least not in the ones that I had worked on, but globally it involves making sure that everybody who has a voice that's relevant to what's going on is heard, and that there is a response to how they put their comments or what they said, and then whoever has the deciding factor goes on and makes their decision. And there's absolutely no guarantee, obviously, and that's part of consultation and not approval, right, that those decisions will be made where the other party wants them to go, but that their reactions and thoughts have been given due diligence and have been heard by the group. Yeah. You had a comment?
Yeah, it sort of follows up with the idea of consultation, and I was wondering, when we were talking about the idea of educational policy, would not that co-development of those components in the Act that regard consultation, that say in areas where the board and the Senate need to communicate and consult each other, would not the development of those educational policies listed in that thing support knowing that you've been through a consultative process?
Sorry, a quick follow-up.
Well, just thinking about that section where it refers to in the Act where the Senate, in consultation with the board, develops educational policy. And is that policy to be interpreted as policy, as in articulated, documented procedures for the institution? Or are those to be inferred as a need to be as an occasional basis as those events arise?
I think it contemplates both of those meanings. It's a necessary implication of the way that section is phrased that it's the board that will develop the educational policy. The consultation arises as a precondition to the board's development of the policy, and I think the result is not narrowly predicted. It could be the sort of document that is quite regulatory. So in relation to this issue, we will do these things in this way, or it could be more overarching. These are the principles that will guide our decision making with respect to qualifications for faculty members. I'm just quickly looking at the section. The educational policy could relate to the evaluation of programs and educational services, and there you might have a rather regulatory sort of document that articulates a process within some general guidelines. On the other hand, qualifications for faculty members might be very much a guideline document. We want everybody to have 3 PhDs so we can offer multidisciplinary studies everywhere or whatever, And so I don't think it's narrowly predictive in that sense.
All right, we had a comment down the front.
Oh, I had a question for Corey. Thank you for reminding us about the Senate Joint Task Force with the board. Can you just remind me who's participating in that?
So if you can't hear the questions, who's participating in the Joint Task Force? Yeah.
Well, on behalf of the Senate, Deanna has been, Wade has been. Yes. Mark is on there now.
The chairs of the committees.
I chair the committee. And on behalf of the board, we've got Amber and
myself.
I think I still.
Yeah.
You are. Okay.
And myself.
You, Kristen, and John, of course, is there. Who else? And Anne. I think that's the bulk of the members that we've got. Well, Wade is no longer on, is he?
Yeah, he is.
He is from
3 more weeks.
just a few more weeks. Okay, all right.
3 of us.
So there'll be 3 of you, 3 board members, and John. So that's basically who's on the task force.
All right, thank you. Yeah, if it's,
3 of us will be lost.
okay. So will they be looking for 3 new members then, or is it? Don't know. Okay, all right. Yeah, Scott, and then up at the front.
Patrick, just on the consultation point, the Hackett cases, I mean, the relationship between the Crown and First Nations people, that's sort of the high water mark.
Yeah, it arises obviously in a constitutional context, sure.
Yeah, and so you're not suggesting that the relationship between the board and the Senate is a fiduciary relationship?
I think governors and senators have a fiduciary relationship to the institution, though, Scott. And so while I don't think that the relationship between the 2 bodies is per se fiduciary, I think the existence of a fiduciary duty to the institution significantly informs the way both governors and senators should conduct.
Sure, but the duty to consult between the Crown and First Nations peoples is one.
Well, it's to do with
there's a huge power imbalance there.
Yeah, it's to do with
different relationship between 2 bicameral. I mean, if you look at the Senate and the House of Commons, I mean, there wouldn't be the same. So, I mean, there isn't the same kind of relationship in any bicameral system.
No. In Haida Nation, it's obviously to do with the honor of the Crown and, as you say, the recognition of the historical position of the First Nations on. But that's not quite, I mean, I acknowledge the different context, but I think the comments about the principles that govern meaningful consultation are useful where the legislature requires 2 bodies with governmental responsibilities to work effectively together to ensure institutional interests are advanced. I don't think, and this goes to the point about there not being a fiduciary relationship between the bodies, I don't think that there is, in the technical sense, such a relationship, but I think there's pretty clearly an expectation they'll deal with each other in good faith, that they'll deal with each other on the basis of informing each other of matters that are relevant to the decision and issue. In other words, it's not a cat and mouse game that the legislation contemplates between the Senate and the board, where one sees if it can fool the other. They're meant to work together, not necessarily to agree on everything, of course, but they're meant to work together, as I said in my paper, in the interest of the institution. So I see the value of Haida Nation as being the detailed discussion in the Supreme Court of Canada of the sorts of principles that govern, the sorts of legal principles that govern an obligation to consult. I stand by my view that they are of utility in this context.
But if you look at the criteria, there's really, I take sort of 2 objective framing. This goes to the question, the earlier question from here. Frankly, I still share the confusion around exactly what the duty to consult means, depending on where it is in the statute. I mean, where there's obviously approval, that means approval, that's not consultation. But where there's consultation with the Senate to maintain and keep proper order and condition of real property, what's the extent of, what's the reasonable expectation that the board has in terms of what they're obligated to do there? And for instance, does it require deep consultation? These are the sorts of things that I have struggled with historically, and that I would certainly appreciate greater clarification on, because, of the different factors there, I count 9 of them. There's really 2. There's the meaningful consultation requires sufficient information. That's, I think, arguably objective, right? You've got to have enough information there for the other side to be able to give you that kind of consultation meaningfully. And then you've got to satisfy the duty. To satisfy the duty doesn't require an agreement. That's clearly objective. Yeah. But the rest of it, frankly, strikes me as being very subjective and very much within the eye of either 2 institutions. And I think I would appreciate some guidance in terms of some specific things of what consultation means in each of the articulated sections, because in order to avoid that kind of disagreement from arising.
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts on that, so I'll come to them in a second, but it can't be made simple when there's, to some degree, an element of inherent complexity to it. Like, I don't think there's a checklist. I guess if it were me running the show, I'd be looking to, I know from talking with John, there's been a challenge here and there around this issue, and so I'd be looking to find a way, in a structural sense, a way to start to address that, and that's why I commented earlier that the Joint Task Force might be a useful place to begin. I do think the Supreme Court of Canada's comments about proportionality are important. I mean, Trent was shutting down a portion of the institution. If you go and read the case, you'll see that there was a lot of consultation, the sort of full-blown, deep consultation, to use the word of Haida Nation, took place. They had this representative committee. I mean, I think, I'm going a bit by memory, I think they spent a year, meeting with the community, meeting with institutional interests, all the rest of it, students, faculty, support staff. There was a lot of deep consultation, submissions received. Well, if you're shutting down a faculty or a portion of the institution, the Richmond campus is going by the boards, deep consultation might be proportionately required. On the other hand, as I said earlier, if you're expanding a small program, that might be something that a committee of three dealt with, a chair and somebody from the Senate and somebody from the board, because the implications just aren't that significant. The allocation of resources is not so great to hire 2 new faculty. It's just, so I think the proportionality point matters quite a bit. The emphasis on what I'll call, the court doesn't use the phrase, but what I'll call fair dealing, that the consultation process is approached by those who are involved in it with a view to candor, reasonableness, and the appropriate sharing of information. That's my point, that it's not a cat and mouse game where one side's trying to fool the other. But I think the institution could start to work towards filling the gaps in, and I think it's preferable that the institution, rather than the judges or the legislature, fill those gaps. And so I guess I'm advocating today the institution moving in that direction, starting to try and establish some agreed frameworks within which consultations will take place. I mean, I could think of a number of different approaches. You could either make it issue specific, or you could have, like a temperature control on a stove. You could have high, medium, and low, depending on the proportionality consideration. But the case law isn't going to provide the kind of deeply detailed analytical framework that I sense the institution is interested in having. As said at the beginning, one reason I'm talking about Haida Nation is because no case that I'm aware of talks about this in an institutional context.
And if I could support that, I think that within the legal parameters, they're actually giving you the opportunity to make this custom-made to a certain sense in terms of what works for all of you, what's the most efficient, what's the most effective. And this is obviously, or at least with some of you, a sticking point, and it's obviously been a sticking point in the past. So one of the suggestions might be moving forward that, you need to address this, and you need to hash out exactly, if you're going to have a checklist, or if it's per situation, or how is it going to be, and everyone needs to be on the same page in terms of that. But it is an opportunity to develop this policy to make sure that it works for both groups and the president and, everything that you need it to do, right? We had questions up front.
Yeah, Patrick, I'm Amric Burke from the Board of Governors. Just a question in relation to Section 27 and powers of the board. We've heard of advice, consultation. There's a couple of them that says with approval of the Senate, and similarly, I just want to ask on that is, and I asked in the context of the board has one employee, the president. And the other context is we are a polytechnic university and we're looking to define that or moving forward, and that may certainly involve new faculties, new departments down the road. And there's two sections in Section 27 that refer to that one must have the approval of the Senate to establish procedures for the recommendation and selection of candidates, and the other one is the approval of Senate for establishment of faculties and departments. You look at the approval of Senate in that, what context, what responsibility does that ensue on the part of the Senate in terms of that approval? And what do you suggest, and let me speak hypothetically, if there's an impasse in that? What's the recourse if there's an impasse in that approval procedure? Should the board put forth a new faculty, new department that requires the approval of the Senate, and similarly puts forth a selection process for senior administration, and there's no approval for Senate? What do you do in terms of impasse if that approval is not there? And then what steps should be part of that approval?
Sure. I mean, there's a legal answer to the question and a non-legal answer to the question. The legal answer to the question is if the Senate is required to give its approval and it won't, that's the end of that. I mean, it means what it says, and it's clearly a precondition to the proposed course of action on the part of the board in the cases we're talking about to obtain the Senate's approval. And there was a flavor of that in Kolchiski, where the position being taken by the petitioners, the people challenging the board's decision, one of whom was a senator. Keep in mind, it wasn't the Senate challenging the board's decision. There was a flavor of that where one of the positions they took was the board didn't have the authority to do what it was proposing to do without the Senate's approval. Court rejected that and confirmed that the board did have the authority. This is the reverse of the same coin. I mean, if we'll use the example of establishing procedures for the recommendation and selection of candidates for president, deans, and so forth, if the Senate was presented with procedures that the board proposed to establish in relation to those matters and refused to approve, the board would be stuck, as I say, in law. But that's the legal answer. And as I said earlier in my talk, I think what the Act is really focused on is governance. And that strikes me as, at some level, and I don't, we're talking about a hypothetical, I don't prejudge which level it might be, there's been a failure of governance at that point. And that doesn't mean that if there hadn't been a failure of governance, there would necessarily be a successful outcome. But it strikes me that a lot of water should have flowed under the bridge before the Senate and the board reached true impasse on something like that. In other words, it shouldn't be so difficult that true impasse has resulted. Before true impasse resulted, I'd obviously be looking at involving a facilitator, a mediator, striking a new committee with new people. It may be that relationships have broken down, irretrievably between some of the key personalities. Maybe that the board's proposals are inherently unreasonable. It may be that some unspoken concern of the Senate's is really the impediment. Who knows? But at the end of the day, if the governmental process can't break through the logjam, the impasse, then the statute will speak and the board won't be able to act. Now, given the nature of the areas where the approval is required, that, as I say, would strike me as a pretty significant failure of governance. But the Senate's approval in those sections where it's required is just that, a precondition.
The young lady who's been patiently waiting.
Can we get to use the microphone when you speak?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, hi. I'm Carrie. And I don't know if necessarily you'll be able to speak to this, but you may. One thing that's sort of been apparent me, in my short time being on Senate and being in some of the meetings for committees as well, in general, is, and I'd like to address the end part here where it talks about flourishing, because from what I can see in terms of difficulties in consultation and respecting the consultation process, there's different ideas of what flourishing can be. While I don't think any of us question that we want our university to flourish, we all have different ideas of what that looks like. And that may be where a lot of the disagreement comes from. And I don't feel as though there's been a lot of discussion on flourishing and what we want to, and whether or not we need one single definition of how Scotland can flourish, but at least respecting that everyone does have different ideas and making room for representations of those flourishing, of that flourishing to take place, may impede the consultation process, if that makes sense.
So in terms of the actual meetings themselves, is it people that feel they're not being heard, or is it simply not moving forward, or?
I feel like it's unspoken.
Okay.
And I mean, I desperately want to talk about the flourishing of the university, but I know that there's a strategic planning sort of committee that's been struck, and I think that's really cool. And I think those sorts of discussions may need to happen more between the board members and the Senate members and the general community as, you know, what do we consider to be successful for university? What do we consider to be enriching for our experience here?
So having more of a vision?
Yeah, because I mean, we talk about having a vision statement, but I don't know if necessarily it includes the idea of flourishing.
Right, okay. And when you say it's unspoken, what would you put that to? Do you have an idea?
I feel like the conversations may, in some ways, they don't meet in terms of actually getting to the heart of like where decisions are being made from, and perhaps we need to speak more about that.
All right. Okay. Thanks for putting that forward. Do you have questions, sir?
Thank you. What I have is more of an observation rather than a question for Patrick. While I think it's important that we understand responsibilities and fiduciary duty, and I certainly agree with your comments there about we all have a fiduciary duty to the institution, whether we're a member of Senate board or what have you. And we all have a responsibility to understand, there is a need for us all to understand our responsibilities. My observation, personally, is that we don't have enough framework, and I'm picking up on your word there, and process defined for communication. A lot of discussion has gone on, but what I fail to see is adequate communication about those discussions to the different levels. And I think, certainly from my perspective, that's what leaves a lot of question marks in my mind. What am I supposed to do? What do I question? What do I not question? What information do I have to question? And so I think it comes back, and it's just because of my orientation historically is about process and communication.
So in terms of reporting out after meetings, do you need to know what you know?
There are minutes, and you know, those responsibilities are taken, but somehow or other we don't have a roadmap for all of the necessary communications and responsibility. At a certain point in time, you need to do this, or this information needs to be available, and so on. It doesn't seem to be defined.
And going back to your point, it sounds like there's missing a concrete piece there in terms of the process, in terms of what happens next, in terms of, all right, okay. Anyone else want to?
Just trying to follow up on this discussion. I think, but I think that, when you start talking about governance and versus advocacy, and you're also talking about cooperation and collaboration. But then kind of stuck in my mind, is how's collaboration different from consultation? I think, collaboration is at a higher order, a higher level. And I think from my observations, what's missing is really true truly collaboration that's taking place. When every time there's a disagreement, when we go back to say, where is the framework? Where am I, according to the legislation, am I obligated to consult? Then it gets in the way of collaboration, gets in the way of establishing trust. I think ultimately, I mean, it takes time, but ultimately what I think maybe what my version of the committee, what's that committee called?
The joint task
force. It's really kind of, I guess ultimately, it's really good platform for the Senate and the board to meet and start establishing a truly collaborative relationship. Yes, there's vagueness in terms of the University Act, assets, that needs interpretation. But like Patrick said, that actually may be room for us to interpret it in a way that suits us. But as long as we're stuck in saying, going back and what does the legislation tell us to do, instead of how can we make it work for us, then I guess then.
And I would throw out the idea that if you don't have collaboration and trust, you won't have consultation.
No, and then we don't have the open, I guess, the broad discussion about the different point of views and how we go about it should be given.
Yeah. So making the collaboration the piece as opposed to all the legislation. All right, yeah.
I just want to follow up on that because I totally agree with that. I think one of the reasons for tonight, particularly what we'll go into in a few minutes, some social dialogue and particularly a glass of wine, is intended to do that, and exactly that. Because, I think that over the last while, there's we tend to live in our own worlds to a certain extent, and particularly some of us that don't, have jobs at the university. It's difficult to spend time, meaningful time with this group here. This is the group here in this room that basically governs the university, and we do. I think everybody would agree we've got to be on the same page, and there needs to be a high degree of trust, and but there's been suspicion, and suspicions naturally arise because we don't often get together in an environment where we realize that we're just real people. We're all trying to fulfill a role, do a good job, and bring our perspective to the table. And really, we all have an interest in one thing, and that seems the success of Puntland, and we all do that. And so I think through dialogues like this, the task force is one avenue. And I was just talking to Bob here earlier about a situation we went through last year, and that is the selection of the interim president, John. And that became a hugely emotional issue and a huge flashpoint, and different people had a whole bunch of perspectives on that. Remember that?
Sounds like it was fairly unforgettable.
We have bigger issues.
And that particularly the issue, Wendy, is was there a duty to consult? Well, maybe not, but yet, should we have consulted? Should the board have consulted the Senate? We should have. And I think there's a legal aspect that we clearly need to understand. We need to understand our legal roles. But beyond that, there's a relational respect that we need to have for each other. And I think the relational side of it would have suggested, yes, the board should have come to the Senate and listened to the Senate's perspective on that. That's a huge decision. It's a major decision. And so I think it's an example of learning, and I know I've learned through that. And I think there will be other situations in the future. We'll make some mistakes. Hopefully not the same ones. But the whole purpose is for events like this is to really get to know each other, get to understand the perspective that each brings, and respect that. So I appreciate your comments, and thought I'd just add those comments.
Thank you. So we're getting pretty much close to time. What I would suggest is that with dinner, we continue the relationship building and the conversations and the dialogues, because things, yeah, one last comment?
I just have one last comment to elaborate on Carrie's comment about the university flourishing. I believe one of the most important or most foundational aspects is having an understanding, a common understanding of the term polytechnic. And I believe that would lay out the foundation for a polytechnic vision. And I've had numerous conversations with different people, whether it's the board or a Senate, and there is sort of buzz about this misunderstanding or sort of confusion of what it means to become polytechnic and move forward as a polytechnic institution. And so I think discussion about that, common discussion, would allow us to have that foundation and less misunderstanding between the faculties or different interests not being served within faculties, and help us prioritize where we want to move forward.
Yeah. All right. Good. So there's lots of beginnings of ideas buzzing around. This is obviously, I mean, from my perspective at least, this is a starting point. And I'd like to congratulate you for being in the room tonight and being proactive about what's going to happen next. I think when you read the Trent case study, that's enough to turn anyone off from going down that road and becoming entrenched to that point. I'd also like to throw out there that there are groups at work and different power positions and what have you. What it comes down to a lot of the time is individual accountability and making sure that you're doing the best for the university. And sometimes that requires, there's been a lot of change. Sometimes that requires letting go of certain pieces, and sometimes that requires having an open ear to things that normally in the past you might not have, right? So, and it's a difficult transition. So it's great that you're all here and participating in that conversation. And like I said, I would really encourage that it goes on through dinner, because we've obviously started some different, buzzes that are going on. And Sandy, I don't know if people go out and serve themselves or...
Ready for us to get our food and continue the conversation.
All right, perfect. All right, so I invite you to go out and get your dinner if you're staying. Thank you for your active listening, participation, and good luck moving forward.